Tonight's event is about Veteranhood, Rage and Hope in British Ex-Military Life by Joe Glenton, a guided tour through ex-forces life at the heart of a dead empire that attempts to demystify military culture, rescue the veteran from his captors, and discover if a more optimistic, humanist mode of veteranhood can be recovered from the ruins. Joe is a journalist, filmmaker, and award-winning author. He was a British soldier from 2004 to 2010, serving in Afghanistan. He's written on defence, war and the military for Declassified UK, The Independent, The Guardian, Vice and others. And Veteranhood is published by Repeater Books, who do a lot of events with us, so hello to them. Matt Kennard is in conversation with Joe tonight, and Matt is the head of investigations at Declassified UK. He's also the author of Irregular Army and The Racket, and has previously written for New Statesman, The Guardian, The Financial Times, Open Democracy and The Intercept. There's a Q&A box to post your questions at the bottom of the screen, and we'd ask if you keep any questions for tonight's speakers to the Q&A, although we've also got a little chat where you can talk to the other people who are attending, and I'll be posting useful links and things like that for you. If you feel like tweeting about the event tonight, we are at Houseman's Books, and I'll be popping any useful or helpful links that get mentioned in the chat. And with that, I'm going to disappear and hand over to our authors. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Alice, and welcome everyone. It's a real honour for me to be part of this event with Joe, because I've been a fan of his since he took a stand in 2010 against the war in Afghanistan. But subsequent to that, we both published books with Verso and Soldier Box, which is a book I'm sure a lot of you have read. I think was one of the most important books written about the war on terror from the UK side, and really was eye-opening for me in terms of giving a soldier's eye perspective of what was happening on the ground in Afghanistan, and also what happens to an individual who stands up for what he believes in and takes a moral stand. But also, I mean, with Joe, and we can talk about this a bit, and this came across when I read his new book. He is, aside from the insights he provides, he has a way with words which is quite rare. I mean, I read a lot of non-fiction books, and a lot of them are hard to get through. And I don't know how many of you would have read Veteranhood yet, but when you do, you'll see the prose is electrifying. He's obviously, well, he's got a real gift with words. So that I want to talk to him about that later. But that is one of the sort of unique things about Joe, and also about this book, and it came across in Soldier Box as well. I've written about the military too. I published Irregular Army. I'm not sure when Soldier Box was actually published, but I think it might have been the year before. Irregular Army was an investigation I did of the US military and how it had been infiltrated by neo-Nazis and gang members and criminals. But I spent years researching that and talked to countless veterans. And I think, like Joe, that I have it's one of my real interests is the veteran experience, not just in the UK, but around the world, because I think it tells us a lot about our society in general. And I know in his book, actually, in the new book, Joe says he doesn't like the cliche about the military providing a window into the general society, but I think it is true. And also with the new book that Joe's just released, Veteranhood, I've been waiting for this to be written for years. And I've talked to Joe about it on and off as an idea for years. Joe's had this idea for a long time. But we have in England in the UK, this real contradiction between the veteran experience as experienced by veterans on the ground in the UK who have come back from war and come back from service, and the portrayal of them in the media and in popular culture, where they're portrayed as heroes, but the treatment they receive in the UK is often appalling. A lot of them live in poverty, they're homeless, and they struggle with mental health problems which are not taken care of by the institutions which have given them those problems. So that contradiction and the veteran experience and the kind of shattering of that illusion that we're given by the mainstream media is so important. And it hasn't actually been done before this book that's just come out. It's groundbreaking in that way. It's the first real analysis and investigation and personal memoir, which blows open that useful ideology put out by the military and put out by the media. So it's a very important book. Anyway, I'll stop now because you didn't come to hear me speak. But I think as a first question to Joe, as I said, we've been talking about this idea and this contradiction between the presentation of veteranhood and the reality of veteranhood. I would like to ask Joe first, why did it take you so long to get around to writing this? Because this is about a decade, I think, after you published Soldier Box. What was the spur that really pushed you to write this now?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for the introduction, mate. I admire your work, always have as well, and your work on the military has informed mine, and those conversations have informed mine. And yeah, it took a long time, and I think we'll talk about it at various points, but I think it's a product, the idea of powerful institutional experiences shaping you and affecting you, but also it takes a long time to make sense of them and work them out of your system, and that was certainly the case here. And yeah, this book, a book about veterans, it went through various forms, which we discussed as a kind of radical history of veterans, and maybe that's something that will come down the line, and as a more kind of gonzo, kind of lived experience type book, which is kind of what it ended up being. But long story short, it took me a long time to work through it. And as with all my writing, which is good, it's the only stuff that's good is about things that I'm angry about. And I became increasingly angry about this weird kind of duality, I suppose, of like how veterans are portrayed, how they're elevated and dehumanized through that elevation into this kind of heroic, stoic figure, and how we're all supposed to love them and we're encouraged to love them. And actually the people who are doing the encouraging treat them with absolute contempt, unless they're in that small cohort of veterans who are obedient and quiet and who kind of buy into the narrative. Those guys are okay. And also the fallen, as they call them, as if people who die in war kind of pirouette to the ground. The dead don't argue, and so they can talk about the dead and they can elevate the dead, and so on. But I really wanted to talk about how veterans experience the world and problematize some of that stuff and ask questions about why they end up being really reactionary and weird and revanchist when they do. There are reasons for that, and why they sometimes end up having politics kind of like me and you and probably most of the people it's meeting, why some people spin off in that direction, and talk about some of the bigger issues. So I picked out figures like Johnny Mercer, Ant Middleton, not sure what's going on there, but you can find out if you read the book. Captain Tom, he became a huge figure over the course of COVID, and some of the issues were like veterans on the far right, like the kind of celebrity SAS phenomenon, and stuff like that. Just kind of trying to speak to this with interviews and a little bit of theory. I'm no theorist, I don't claim to be, to introduce ideas which are already existing, write a little bit of history of radical veterans, and just bring all that stuff in. But really, it took so long because it's a product of that, any powerful institutional experiences. It messes with you. It takes a long time to start to process that and make sense of it and pick out the useful stuff from the stuff that's just anger and bitterness and contempt for the institution.
I think that's interesting, and I wanted to ask you actually about, because we about this contradictory notion, because we've talked about, and you just mentioned this contradiction between how they're elevated in popular culture and then treated like shit in reality. But I think that the book is full of contradictions, and not in a way that makes it not coherent, but it's a complex issue. And I think one of the things that comes across is that you sort of love the military and hate it at the same time. There are elements of the military, including the good people that you met on the inside, and the veterans that have turned into peace activists and like you. There's a lot of them, and I feel the same sort of thing. There's elements of the military which are good. It's about solidarity and camaraderie. It's about discipline. Obviously, that's not always a good thing depending on what the operation is. But can you just talk a little bit about your own feelings about the military? Because I don't think it's simple, is it?
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting points there. I think that the military and its fanboys and fangirls like to portray it as this kind of coherent, disciplined team, this kind of unified force. And they like to suggest that the kind of writ of class struggle stops at the barracks gate and everyone's kind of on the same side. And I know the veterans in the audience, and I know they're there, will probably be laughing at that, having been through that experience themselves, because the military is chaos. It's chaos, it's riotous all the time. And so I'm trying to kind of speak to that. And some of those contradictions are about that riotousness. And again, it's the product of a powerful institutional experience that you end up having a repulsion. I'm repulsed by some of the things about the army and its history and what it does and how it works. But at the same time, a kind of affection end up fused together somehow. And there are things, and veterans on the left will tell you that they miss. And what the things they miss are those things like solidarity and teamwork and a sense of place. And it can be hard. It can be hard to get past those. And things, I mean, most people will say humor, gallows humor of the military. And it's shared with other people. It's shared with nurses, it's shared with journalists, it's shared with emergency workers, it's shared with firefighters. This kind of gallows humor that comes from being involved in danger and violence and arduous situations. And I still hold to that. I still find a lot of squaddy humor, not all of it, obviously, hilarious, and I have to kind of keep it in check. And again, that's a product of having been through that kind of engine of violence, and that it changes you. And I try and talk about it in the book. It's not just that you're in the army; it's that the army is in you. That you internalize some of its values and its sense of urgency, and the readiness to kind of explode into action that it trains into you. So all those contradictions kind of, you're forced to make them coexist, and it doesn't always work. But you're kind of forced to try and kind of contemplate them and make them function together.
But I guess also in a way, I mean, you come from a working class background. You did belong in the military in a sort of traditional sense more than you feel you belong in the media. I mean, I'm not working class, but I guess I'm lower middle class, but I don't feel I belong in the media. I work for the Financial Times. I always felt completely outside it. So now, after you left the military, it's in the fields you went into, I guess it was impossible to develop that camaraderie and solidarity within those new sectors, because the class of person, their history was completely at odds with yours.
Absolutely, yeah. The only times I've felt anything approaching that is actually on, like, in Afghanistan reporting, where you have to work in a small, close-knit team. Yeah. It is. Veterans have an acute sensitivity and dislike of being told what to do by posh and middle-class people. Some of these guys will have spent 5, 10, 20, 25 years looking at these people and going, why are you telling me what to do? You're absolutely fucking useless. And so when you come out, and it's also a broader problem with the left. I mean, a lot of the people in leadership roles on the left are middle class, and it jars. I think it probably jars for most working class people, but really acutely if you're ex-military. And so, yeah, I came out, and that was another thing I had to work through for a long time, that ended up in a profession. I came out with the kind of crusading idea that I would go and tell the truth, and of course we all try and do that. But what it means is you're in newsrooms with lots of people who are completely unlike you, whose backgrounds are completely unlike you, whose life arc, compared to yours, which might have been full of explosions and interesting things and hardship, seems to be of being born and then going to uni and then getting this job. So it can be very difficult. And also bearing in mind, when I went into a newsroom at an entry level, I was a little bit older. I was kind of 28, 30, and a lot of these people were straight out of City University or wherever. So yeah, those are things. I think any working class person has to work through those when they go to what's essentially a bourgeois job. But it's particularly difficult in some ways for ex-military people, because you've got sick of the officer class, and suddenly the officer class is kids and the editors and are on the panels at the meetings and stuff like that. So it's one example of something that's actually much broader, I think. But I think it's very acute for veterans. Yeah,
it's interesting what you're saying, because in the book, it's part of it is you grappling with with you labeling yourself with a certain ideology. You don't do it, and you do it in a sort of light-hearted way. You say, I'm an anarcho-squaddy, I think I'm now a Marxist, you know. But it's interesting to hear you speak about this like aversion to middle class people or people in a class above you giving you orders, which developed in the military. Can you talk a little bit about how you think the military experience impacted your ideological development? Because I think mostly you describe yourself as an anarchist, libertarian, socialist now. It does sound like that kind of an anarchist feeling comes from that military experience.
Yeah, to a point, I think I went through, I think when I immediately came out of the army, and like it's the case for many veterans, you're quite damaged and confused. And I was probably looking for another cult to join. And I threw myself into politics and really, really committed to it, and found out it had many of the same shortcomings as the army had. And I suppose I was around kind of Trotskyite politics initially. And then in the finest traditions of Trotskyism, fell out with that current and went off into kind of nebulous kind of Marx. I always consider myself a Marxist. I suppose I still do to some point. And not a theoretical one, particularly, a moral one. As I say, I'm not a theorist. And then went through that kind of Oedipal thing where anything that looks like identity politics is bourgeois and should be attacked. I never quite became Stalinist. but there was a little bit of that around it. And I think eventually, with the tutelage of cooler heads, found our way to kind of anarchist politics. Because I think the best critiques come from there. And the people who really, the working class critiques from below of capitalism and empire, but also, left ideas came from anarchist thinkers. And also, I mean, my partner has those politics as well and guided me more recently and shaped my own politics in ways I'm still starting to understand. But that's certainly where I end up now. Anarcho-squatting was actually a joke, and it's two completely irreconcilable things, you would think. Though I recall my first unit, 13 Air Assault Regiment, completely unknowingly, our drop zone flash was the anarchist flag. It was black and red cut in half. So maybe there was an element of fate there as well. Right. But I certainly ended up with those politics. And I think that's where the richest critiques of the world come from.
A lot of the book is you talking to people on the inside and also your friends that have left that have gone on a similar trajectory to you. But really, you were kind of like the only one that removed yourself in a very public way and rejected it. What was it about you specifically that made you different to everyone? And how do the soldiers that are still on the inside and those who have left how do they deal with you now? I mean, are they privately quite supportive, or do a lot of them say you're just an arsehole who's a traitor to the cause?
Yeah, some say both. Some have both positions.
Right.
To be honest, yeah, a mix of things. Like I'm still mates with a lot of guys I was in the military with. A lot of guys I went to Afghanistan with, good friends, and they now have come to. Some of them are quite right wing, but they are critics of the Afghan war, for example. They're not going to become anarcho-syndicalists or anything, but they're understandably critics from the right of the conduct of the war, etc., etc. Others have developed similar politics. Why I ended up there, it's impossible to quantify really for it having been lived. I am a kickoff merchant. I had kind of vaguely libertarian parents and a vaguely libertarian upbringing. I don't mean that in a political sense; they weren't really political, but there's probably something in that. There's a kind of working class sense of what's right and wrong, justice, and that we shouldn't, if we ever said anything vaguely sexist or homophobic, we'd get clipped around the ear. And so they guided us. They tried to make us moral people, I think. But I don't know that that's vastly different from most other people. So it's difficult to quantify how I ended up doing that. And of course, I'm not the only one. There were other objectors to the Afghan-Iraq wars as well. And any war throws up resistance, and the military constantly throws up resistance all the time. I suppose the difference with me is that it was quite public, that I decided that I would kind of stick it to the army and campaign while I was still serving. Whereas a lot of people, completely understandably, I'm not going to moralize about it, leave the military and don't want to go through that because the risks are very high. They can, as they did with me, they tried to send me to prison for many years. But I am a relentless gobshite and kept pushing. But why that is exactly, I mean, it's I'd have to reflect on that more deeply. I'm still trying to figure it out. It's one of the things I didn't figure out in the 10 years that passed since the left the army and military prison.
And I should ask this question before I forget, because it goes to the heart of the event and the book. But obviously the book's called Veteranhood. It's got a lot of research of you talking to people about their experience of being a veteran in the UK. Can you just sort of outline your main takeaways? What is life like because we've talked about this contradiction between the media portrayal and the reality, but what is the reality? What are veterans of the UK's wars dealing with? Like issues of mental health, poverty. What were the main things that kept coming up?
Yeah, it's a mix of things, and I think it's sometimes generational. I think the millennial veteran, and I'm really right-wing veterans love to slag off millennials all the time, but they overlook the fact we fought the last two wars. I think millennial veterans, their concerns are probably the same as any other people of our kind of age. I think we're both just in that bracket. It's actually really bread and butter stuff like, can I go to uni? Can I get a job? Can I get a house? Will my life be shit in the endless swamp of neoliberalism? Particularly veterans on the left, I think that's generally speaking the analysis. There's lots of older veterans who have a similar analysis as well. I think you can start looking at it in a different way. I think if we were to pick out a generation who are particularly bitter, it would be kind of Northern Ireland, Falklands era veterans. A lot of the guys on Facebook, in the Facebook groups, calling for BLM protesters to be shot and going on about how Jeremy Corbyn and Shamima Begum have ruined Britain. A lot of those guys are Northern Ireland veterans. And so there's a deep well of bitterness about that generation of veterans. That said, it's not the whole story. Lots of those guys ended up being around Veterans for Peace, for example, and have ended up with different kinds of left-wing politics, from social democracy to kind of really percussive anarchists. So it's not the whole story. I think this generation, it's contested where we will end up. We could end up being the next generation of what I call blazers, the blazer veterans, the kind of right-wing reactionary veterans who want to shoot all the BLM protesters or whatever. It could be the case, and that's contingent on many things. There is a strong pull. Military culture exerts a strong pull, and these hegemonic institutions like the RBL and ex-services organisations try and drag veterans back in. They want you rattling a tin, a charity tin, and they want you sat selling shit war stories in the Royal British Legion over half a pint with your mates. Whether that happens is contingent on a bunch of different things. I know that the World War II generation, many of whom I've met over the years, it's a dwindling generation now, sadly, are very different again from those two. And a lot of that seems to stem from the fact that their war, their position is their war was justified. Hitler had before, and I wouldn't really advance any argument against that. It's probably true. I've got no problem with shooting fascists. And they're coming, and they're also coming from a time where working class traditions of solidarity and trade unions and stuff were much stronger, and so a lot of them had those politics already before they ended. I think that's also true for the World War I generation, who've all now sadly gone. So there are a couple of things going on there, but some of it I feel, and what came out in the book, is generational. Their concerns stem from where they are generationally.
And what I found quite interesting in the book as well is that, I mean, we all know about the traditional conservative right-wing support for the military in words anyway, and rhetoric. But often the left is seen as anti-military, or sort of reflexively. And you talk quite a bit about how a lot of rebellions, left-wing revolutionary movements have involved veterans and even active duty soldiers in them. Can you just talk a little bit about that and about how that kind of history has been buried? I mean, one example I was thinking of today is Hugo Chavez, who was an officer in the Venezuelan army before he was elected president. But there's obviously countless other examples, but we don't hear about that much. And the second part of that question, can you just talk a bit about how you see the left perception of the military and the problems with that perception?
Definitely, yeah. I tried my hand at writing a bit of history, and I had good historians to draw on, people like John Rees and E.P. Thompson. And I had my partner as a historian who cringed at my attempts to write about things that happened in the past, but helped me, but guided me. And I write one of the chapters is basically a potted history, all the way back to the kind of peasants' revolt, Wat Tyler, veterans of the 100 Years' War, organising there, particularly the Putney debates. I start with the Putney debates, the New Model Army. I'm trying to develop this idea of a radical military tradition. And that was an army that unionised, the rank and file unionised themselves, and they wrote the first rough draft of a democratic constitution for liberal democracy. And it wasn't Greek philosophers and Voltaire, it was these blood-stained, dirt-smeared soldiers from the battlefield. And that runs all the way through the Napoleonic Wars, after which veterans were discharged en masse and started to organise. One was famously killed at the Peterloo Massacre, a guy called John Lees, who'd been at Waterloo. And I try and follow it all through the First World War, when there were many mutinies, and then afterwards there was different kinds of activism and organisation, renters' unions, veterans' federations, which eventually were kind of all forced into what became the RBL, this monolithic charity, very much a ruling class institution. Then into the Second World War, the Cairo parliaments, which was a kind of, the officers decided to let the bored soldiers in Cairo have a practice of democracy, and they made up these parliaments. I think it lasted 3 days, because the veterans on the ground started to vote for mad things like nationalising the Bank of England, education and housing for everyone, and decolonising Egypt. And the officers, they set off at too brisk a pace, and it was very quickly closed down. But that informed a lot of post-war politics and the veterans' vote after the Second World War. And then you have things like the 43 Brigade, which is a group of mostly Jewish servicemen, ex-servicemen who fought fascists on the streets of London and around the country after the Second World War, and all the way up through more individual examples. There are flashes, which are the individual examples, and then explosions, which are when mass groups of veterans and soldiers start kicking off. So examples like me, young Ahmed al-Batati was one of the most recent. I talk about him and his place in that kind of pantheon of rebel veterans and rebel soldiers. So I try and kind of sketch that out. The topic is worthy of books upon books, but I try to just capture it and just to show that there is another way, that veterans aren't just one thing. They aren't just small C Tories or fascists. There is another tradition which we should discover and embrace.
I mean,
what was the other question, sorry?
Oh no, I mean that answers it. But it's interesting to hear you talk about that, because obviously when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that as a group, active duty soldiers and the veteran community is a potentially very powerful group within society if they go the wrong way, against the state that they previously worked for or currently work for. And it seems like so much money and effort is put into upholding this ideology of hero worship, because they're scared that if they lose those people, they could have a really big impact. I mean, we saw it after Vietnam, with Vietnam syndrome and the anti-war movement there. Yeah. How likely do you think? I mean, now we've got. I mean, there is some symmetry between what happened in Vietnam and what's happened in Afghanistan recently. What chance do you think there is for a sort of mass campaign of dissent from either the veteran community or even active duty soldiers against the militarized state and against war, or are they under control?
I think it's difficult, and one of the key differences there is conscription. Vietnam was a conscript army. World War I and II, there was the issue of slow and cumbersome demobilisation to organise rounds. Now we have a professional army, which is very small, increasingly smaller, because it's the Tories who've cut it. The Tories who love the army have cut it down. And so it's slightly different. Also, people are more atomised, I think, nowadays, so it's difficult. It's difficult to imagine where that would come from. A lot of the resistance is kind of folded under charities. The charities have a function of a kind of union, but it's a kind of top-down union. When it was founded, very few veterans, I think it was 1 in 10 actually joined the British Legion, because there were traditions of working class solidarity which already existed. One trade union leader called the Royal British Legion Field Marshal Haig's White Guards, and that's how they saw it. Because what, of course, can also happen is that veterans can end up being pulled into radicalism of the right. You see that with the kind of Freikorpsist stuff, the fascist stuff in Germany, for example, but also in France. You see it with the Confederate Army after the American Civil War, that they want to discipline this kind of mythical, almost a woke enemy, a kind of feminized traitor enemy within. I mean, it's very similar language to what some veterans, to that which some veterans use today about narratives of betrayal. We saw it at Capitol in January last year, where the protests were full of veterans. I think 1 in 5 of those who ended up on trial were veterans, which is a much higher rate than veterans are present in American society. So there's a lot of stuff going on there.
It's interesting you bring that up because obviously that was the subject of my first book was neo-Nazis in the US military. And I have to say, just from my sort of, I haven't done as much research on it as you, but I have to say that I think that if you were going to put money on whether the veteran community went far right or far left, they'd be going far right. That's the way the sort of momentum's going.
Yeah.
And actually, also to go back to your point about conscription, it's a very important point, and that's why they're so wary of ever instituting conscription because of the Vietnam experience. In the war on terror in the US, they definitely needed to institute conscription. They couldn't get enough soldiers, but the Bush administration quite consciously talked about the fact that they couldn't do it because they didn't want to generate this kind of anti-war feeling on a mass scale within the US for an already unpopular war. So. That is true. It's depressing, I guess. But in terms of the far right and the UK military, because I did quite a lot of work on the US, but I don't know that there was some stuff a couple of years ago about Nick Griffin, when he was actually a thing, was going on about how there was lots of BNP members inside. But then obviously recently there has been neo-Nazi soldiers that have been, I think have been actually been prosecuted.
One was sent to jail a couple of years ago, and there have been various examples. It's kind of revealed in flashes because there haven't been big investigations into this. There have, for example, in Germany, where they found a network of neo-Nazis in high-ranking special forces and police, but less so here. So it kind of every now and then a story comes up. I've tried to map those in the book. So there's an example of for example, a nuclear submariner, which is terrifying, who was involved in Generation Identity. One of the far right identitarian groups, examples of people in the EDL, examples. A lot of far right stuff in the military is loyalist in character, which you can imagine. So some of the Scottish regiments, some of the Irish regiments, they have Irish on the name, but of course they're loyalist in character, very much so. There will be Catholics in them as well, and they often have a hard time. I know some of them. But yeah, it is there, and it's always kind of bubbling under the surface. And of course, the military is a right-wing institution.
I was going to say, you wrote an article for The Guardian calling it a far-right institution, didn't you?
Far-right institution, yeah. And it's important that we kind of unpack that a little bit. So when you look at the institution, I look at it from the sense that there are far-right things that the far-right do. And it's like power, submission, an obsession with those things, a weird kind of ancestor worship. All these things are indicative of kind of far right ideology. And the military does all that. It does all that. It kind of celebrates its past of colonial violence. You go into the officers' mess in a given regiment. The regimental colours will be on the wall, and it will be the names of Indian towns which were massacred and bombarded in the Indian Mutiny, or various examples of colonial violence and massacres of people of colour, be they Indian, African, or wherever. It's written into the DNA of the military, this kind of weird ancestor worship. And we see examples in the US as well. So there's recently been an effort to rename a load of bases because they were named after Confederate generals. And there are bases in this country which are named after battles, which are named after, there's Churchill Barracks, Wellington Barracks. Wellington cut his teeth in India, obviously conquering India. So examples here as well. But it's kind of built in there. It's built in there.
I mean, I'm wary of time because I want to go to some questions. So I just want to ask one more question for myself, which is a bit off topic of what we've been talking about. But I think for me, and I don't know if this is the same for other people who have read the book, but one of the major unique points about Veteranhood is the writing. I mean, I've read a lot of non-fiction books, and there's non-fiction books about, I don't know, I've read about going out and interviewing victims of austerity and blah, blah, blah. And they're important books, and I've enjoyed reading them. But this is not just a journalistic book. It's written in a really unique and sort of gonzo style way, which is not easy to do. And I just wanted to ask you a bit about your literary history. I mean, what kind of writers have influenced you through the years? Because there's some serious talent there and gift. I wondered what's that sort of based on, or does it just come naturally?
No, I've had no literary training whatsoever. I think I just kind of write how I think. People who've influenced me, it's very often, weirdly, or maybe not weirdly, combatant writers. I think people who've had military experience or experience of war and become writers write very briskly and quite straightforwardly, and tend not to embellish or be flowery. They want to kind of make the point. So I think I've always tried to do that. I always wrote as a kid, but then I gave up because I got interested in girls and joining the army, and kind of abandoned that. Felt emasculated by the idea of writing. It's kind of what can go with working class culture, and abandoned it until many years later, and then kind of had to relearn. I started diarising my experiences in jail, and it kind of came from there. And then I've developed it over many years, and I've been edited by good people like yourself and Mark and many other good editors over the years.
Well, we take out all creativity. That's how we just beat it down.
Yeah. But I think that adds to the kind of briskness, and then I think it's about synthesizing interesting language with being really brisk and straightforward. I think Hunter S. Thompson.
Yeah.
Hemingway, problematic character, fantastic writer. I don't care.
Yeah. You know what it reminded me of, because I studied in the States and worked there for a long time, and I got quite into the gonzo writers for a while, and it really reminded me of Norman Mailer. It had that very, I mean, not the same sort of ego, but the style of writing, it reminded me of him. And he was in the military. His first novel was a military that sort of launched him, was based on his experiences in World War II, I think.
Yeah, The Naked and the Dead, I believe it's called.
That's it, yeah.
I haven't read it that much, but that's high praise, mate. That's high praise.
Well, it's just rare. I mean, I read so many. I mean, like the way I write is just boring, sort of journalistic style.
No,
so to read something that's, well, it's free spirited. It's good. It's good. But anyway, I will. It's now, we're 40 minutes in, so I've been told that we should go to some questions. And we've got some. George says, oh no, it's now gone. Where's George? Oh yeah. George says, what is the role, and this goes back to some of the points that we've been making about the different different parts of the spectrum, how they approach the military and veterans from the left to the right. And this one's about centrists. What is the role of centrists in the dehumanization and or instrumentalization of veteranhood?
Yeah, they love it. They absolutely love it. I remember in one of Keir Starmer's, the earliest of his 400 resets of Labour, came out with this document, or rather the document was leaked, flags, forces and families. And that's very much, it's kind of, on military matters, you can't get a cigarette paper between a Tory and many other matters and a centrist. I don't mean a liberal. I know there are still good old-fashioned liberals out there, but centrists. And they're absolutely the same. And you see that expressed in the things like Labour Friends of the Armed Forces, which is like a weird, quite far right stage prop sponsored by arms firms. So it's pretty much the same position. There are also lots of liberal veterans, I know. Sometimes it's impossible to imagine there would be a liberal veteran, but there's a group called Veterans for EU, not my bag at all. But they are, because they're funny, unlike centrists, they're actually a lot better. They're not completely tedious, bland people. They're actually a lot better than your average kind of centrist-ish liberal person. But yeah, the centre you will find is profoundly militarist, but they frame it in different language. Dan Jarvis is a good example. He's a former parachute regiment major. I don't think he's a bad. I don't have any personal beef with him, but he frames it in kind of liberal language, the language of liberal interventionism. Give war a chance. Don't let Iraq stop us invading Iran. This kind of stuff, and very often in the kind of sepia tones of World War II. And they cite, Tories do it as well, but in a different way. Centrists kind of go, look at the socialist traditions of World War II and World War I. And it's complete fact. It's a Marshall fantasia. And I talk about Marshall fantasias a lot in the book. So we all have them to a degree, but that's the centrist one.
Okay, I got another quite interesting question. And this is actually related to the work that I've been doing over a number of years. But the question is, has the recruitment of mercenaries changed the shape of wars, and how? So I did a story for The Guardian, actually, a couple of years ago about Hereford, and how Hereford had become this centre of private military companies because it's right next to Credenhill, which is where the SAS is based. And I interviewed a bunch of people, and it was clear that a lot of people were leaving the military and cashing in with these private military companies. And it has huge implications for like fundamentals of how we understand our politics and our system, because the state's power has traditionally relied on on having control over the use of force effectively. Now, if that's moving into the corporate realm, that really does pull elemental power away from what is overtly a democratic state. So, can you talk a bit about that? Firstly, like about the implications of that, but also what you've personally seen from people you've known, veterans. Have a lot of them gone into the sort of private mercenary world?
Yeah, quite a few have, particularly guys from infantry type or special forces backgrounds. There was a kind of gold rush after Iraq where nightclub bouncers from Wigan were turning up with guns to pretend to be SS soldiers, and that was eventually kind of not sorted out, but it became harder to do that. But definitely, I've seen people go and do it, and they end up more traumatized than they were before. And I get the appeal, I get the draw of going and doing it because the money was very good back then. And if you're a soldier, that's all you've got. If you're an infantry soldier, what else do you come out with? You're not going to go to, put on your CV, I can fire a mortar. What kind of job is that going to get? There's a broader like social point about transition in there somewhere. Fundamentally, the increase, and it's part of a kind of multi-pronged thing. Iraq and Afghanistan were disasters. We can't do wars like that anymore. So we use drones, we use air power, we use local militias, which is what I was covering in Afghanistan last year. And we use mercenaries, and it makes things less accountable. And the mercenary firms, that's what call them what they are. They like to think of themselves as private military firms and all this stuff. Mercenary firms will tell you, like any free marketeer, they're the people best placed to govern themselves and be self-regulated, which of course we know is wrong. Various massacres emerged just in the era of Iraq and Afghanistan from the unregulated use of military force, very often by states, very often by things like the Foreign Office, DFID, and NGOs have had budgets in the past for private military contractors, mercenaries. They're working in places where they feel that's necessary. So it's all bad. All the news is bad about the increase in private military activity.
And it's not just states as well. That was quite interesting in the research that I was doing. The corporations themselves can mass big armies. I mean, like I went to Colombia to look into the banana company Chiquita, which is formerly United Fruit. It changed its name because United Fruit has such a bad reputation in Latin America. But Chiquita actually were convicted in the US for hiring mercenaries, private companies, to murder trade unionists and activists against their projects. So that was one of the rare cases because it was actually prosecuted under the Alien Tort Statute in the US. But usually they just get away with it because there's also this when you start employing corporate companies to do this stuff, you have a level of plausible deniability. There's a chain which is much harder to get back to the responsible party for. So it's really, really worrying for that.
Exactly. I know. Just to come in, I can't remember his name. Eric, whatever his name is, the guy from Blackwater, later Z. A couple of years ago,
Eric Prince, yeah.
A piece which didn't even announce his murderous background in the Guardian, talking how we needed to. He was the man. His firm was the one to securitize the borders of Europe during the refugee crisis. And that is important because of the climate crisis, because the EU, liberal and wonderful as it is starting to militarize its borders and securitize its borders. So this stuff is going to be ongoing. And the people doing that are most likely to be private defense firms of this or that kind, making lots of money out of people's pain and suffering. Yeah.
And the other thing that I saw in this sort of research was that the conception that we have of like a distinction between the state and the corporation on this stuff, but on everything really is just wrong. There is no distinction anymore. The states just work for corporations nakedly. It's not an adversarial relationship at all. And actually, I went to Israel and Palestine to do a story about how Israel was privatizing its occupation of Palestine, and that was chilling because there's quite a lot of research now about what they call global Palestine, how a lot of stuff, the sort of surveillance, privatized surveillance and repression starts in Israel because they have a captive population where they can test this stuff out, and then it goes global. And they send people all over the world to take this to places like Brazil and other places. So, yeah, it's a really, just to go to back to the question. It's an extremely worrying development, and it's blowing up because, as Joe says, there's no regulation. And the companies I interviewed in Hereford, they were giving the excuses that Joe said, that we're fine to self-regulate. We don't need government regulations. And that's the way it stayed. There's nothing that really stops these people doing whatever they want. And there's a lot of money to be made. So I think it will be one of the major stories of our future, because as all these crises develop, like climate change and refugee crises and inequality widening, there's going to be a increasing separation of the elite 1% and everyone else, and they're going to need to secure themselves. And these companies are just going to have a huge market to protect our overlords, and that's the way the world's going. And also the borders that Joe talks about. Let me just go to another question. Okay, this is a good one. This is from Gareth Addy. He says, does Joe think commanders in the British Army take infiltration by far-right groups seriously? Love the book, by the way. Thanks,
mate. Do they take it seriously? There was an amazing document that appeared a couple of years ago, and it was kind of like, it was almost like those old 50s guides about how to spot a communist, but it was about how to spot extreme right-wing people in the army. And it had all these things to look for, and I found it really strange, because most of the things you have to look for are kind of required of you in the army. It's like excessively patriotic behaviour and being really nationalist. And basically, this is an organisation where you have to wear the flag, swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen to get in, and literally kill people for the state. So I mean, all the behaviours are, which are kind of far right, are kind of required of you. It's kind of in the job description. In the military. So I think they generally come out with, like they do with everything, there's a kind of bad apple, a few bad apples. And that's across the board, whether it's the kind of rape allegations which have come out of Kenya recently, the epidemic of sexual harassment, assault against women soldiers, which are ongoing, whether it's someone like me kicking off, causing trouble, refusing to go back to Afghanistan. Their default thing is bad apples. And what it really speaks to, I think, is that this is a really backwards conservative organisation which is desperate to protect itself at any cost. It has a huge PR department. PR Week had an article in this a couple of years, which I always go back to. It has the biggest PR department in terms of personnel of any government department. It's obsessed with image. And what it will generally do is try and say that frame people as outsiders, well, actually in many cases, including some of those I've just mentioned, those behaviours are a product of the organisation. It's kind of what's required of you, or it's a permissive environment for those behaviours.
Yeah, I mean, I had a similar experience in the US when I was interviewing veterans for my book, and I was actually interviewing neo-Nazi veterans who were saying commanders not only knew what I was about, they had tattoos like swastikas and other stuff. They said that they liked that fact. They said they were particularly. They had warrior-like abilities because of this. I mean, so obviously you had to take some of it with a pinch of salt, but I did hear it from a number of different people that not only was it known about, but it was not seen as a drawback. And as Joe says, it does fit in with that whole culture, especially like the degree of sort of cabin fever and xenophobia that develops when you're locked in a base and you just have these like hordes of natives outside that you're told wanted to kill you. That just creates this real xenophobia, I guess.
I talk in the book a little about there's a particular British Army regiment who hero worship the Fallschirmjäger, and lots of people have the tattoos, and they have the Fallschirmjäger, a Nazi era airborne unit, and they have the kind of 10-point code of the Fallschirmjäger, which is like, keep your weapon clean, women will be seen and not heard, all this kind of stuff. In the accommodation block, this is still the case. And I've had various accounts of this. That's the parachute regiment, in case you hadn't guessed. But I mean, this stuff is alive and well, and it's overlooked.
Yeah, I mean, in my research on neo-Nazis in the US military, I had copies of photos of soldiers with swastikas from their MySpace, just taking photos of themselves in Iraq. Like I could find it, like just with a few Google searches, So it wasn't. They didn't try and stamp it out at all. Obviously, they would react when there was a media outcry, and it's the same in the UK. They'll say, "Oh, we've got these strict regulations," but in fact, the regulations in the US, I'm not so sure about the UK, but I've got a feeling it's the same. They're elastic enough that they can kind of they can blow it off if they really want to keep a soldier, and that's basically how they do it. Is they don't have any hard and fast stuff. Okay, next question, because we've got quite a few, is from Michael Ash. This is a good question. In 2021, we're used to seeing veterans represented via organisations like the British Legion. Given what you and some in the audience have said about the importance of camaraderie and the sense of loss of camaraderie many feel, is the left missing a big trick by not making more space for veterans and offering them a new source of camaraderie and gallows humour if you're on the left these days?
Yeah, it's a problem I run into a lot. I mean, it's not, I mean, you've got to be careful how you frame it. I think it's not like, well, let's get the veterans, because the middle class left will go, oh, here's a new cause we can throw our energy and parasitise. So it's more about kind of, if there are people with left-wing ideas, whether they're veterans or not, they should be allowed in. And the fact that they're veterans shouldn't be held against them. It's actually a very small specific parts of the left have beef with veterans, and they're happily marginal and silly, and they're kind of posers. And they're easy to kind of get around. Particularly like working class lefties, most people I know who are working class have had a cousin in, a brother in, a son in, an uncle in. They understand this dynamic, and they have a materialist analysis, which is what we're supposed to have because we're on the left. We're doing the project of reason here, not reaction and moralism. Can get past that, but there are specific sections which have a problem, and I love laying into them. They should be laid into. But on the whole, I think people are okay with it. Like if someone's has fash politics, they're not allowed in. If they're a veteran, they might have a few rough edges, as I did when I came into the left, which you can guide them past. And then there's no reason not to let them in. It depends if they're committed to a kind of project to make the world better. I mean, it shouldn't be a problem. But I mean, there's some weird A-level politics, like veterans are just or soldiers are just policemen. There's a kind of essentialist thing, like people join the army because they're racist. They join the army because they're sexist. They join the army to want to kill people. None of that is worthy of someone who says they're a materialist or a Marxist. None of it. It should be below you. Absolutely basic A-level politics. People join the military almost always because it's a way out of poverty, because they're broke, because they're trying to find some opportunities, and because that career is sold to them slickly by the military as a way to achieve those things. So I have absolutely no time for the left posers, I call them in the book, who just want to have a pop at veterans. And also, armies and wars produce far more radical people than that set. Far more radical people. And I'd rather talk about those people than the kind of left poser set.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I think that the left is missing a trick to the extent that they do dismiss the veteran community for the reasons you've outlined, just some sort of A-level politics, just, oh, they're all like cops or whatever. But actually, yeah, it's lazy. And as you say, like, this is potentially a really radical community because they often come from the working class communities. They've seen the reality of imperialism up close, which none of us mostly ever see anyway. So that's why I've always really been, as a journalist, been really, there's been a lot of appeal for the veteran community because they have a clear-sighted view of the world that hardly anyone else in society had. And the other people that have a clear-sighted view of how the world works are the ones at the top, and you can never get access to them, number one. And secondly, they're the baddies that are trying to project power across the world. So there is a lot of potential with the veteran community. And I think, as you say, Joe, like the left should be open to it. Again, there's this sense of camaraderie that the military provides that doesn't really exist on the left either, because it's dominated by people from a different class. Again, it's not a natural place for people to go.
Yeah, and I think it should be the opposite way around. I mean, it's a broader problem. Working class people should never feel like guests in a working class movement. And I have no problem with the Class A socialists being involved in it. I have a problem with them being in charge all the time. And I think I'd take a working class veteran or a kind of autodidact working class lefty over anyone who went to Oxford or Cambridge, anytime, all day. They're guests in the movements, not us.
Right, this one is from Carl Doram. He says, my question is, well, there's a bit of a preamble, but it says, my question is, what do you think, where do you think the veteran left goes from here? Where are our Putney debates?
Exactly. Carl, I know Carl, former member of the RAF, but I'll let that slide. Like me, he's a big fan of people like Thomas Rainsford, the kind of historical figures of the kind of radical military tradition.
Yeah.
And he's very good on that stuff. It's hard to say. What I want, you know, I'm a romantic at art. I want a horde of anarcho squaddies driving a Challenger 2 through the gates of Downing Street. It's probably not going to happen. Cooler heads, who I talk to in the book, point out it would be hard to create a mass movement of veterans now because the same issues like demobilization and stuff don't exist. The army isn't as big, it's much smaller, it's professional, not conscript. What I would like to see, and I think within our reach, is to have an ongoing interface. So many veterans, even today, veterans were coming to me. And the thing about left-wing veterans is they don't think being a veteran is a personality. They don't have Ken, veteran, pro-Brexit, no PC on their Twitter bio. They don't tend to lead with the fact because they don't think it's a personality. But there are lots of them out there. And as I wrote the book, I found more and more, since we started getting towards publication, more and more have got in touch with me. There are people out there and they're involved in all the movements they should be involved in, like whether it's climate change, whether it's radical independence stuff, whether it's around Corbynism, whether in anarchist stuff, whether in prison solidarity. There are loads of them out there. So I think it's really about, we need to call a conference, Carl, and try and gather people and kind of unpick these issues between us. I don't see a mass movement of veterans emerging. I want there to be. I really want there to be badly, but I think it will be hard to do. I do see ongoing conversations about what we mean and where we go next between those who, some of those who I've spoken to in the book, and also the people who come forward more and more. And hopefully that will happen more. Hopefully the book will help to catalyze something like that.
I wanted to ask just a personal question, just on this issue. So there was an attempt, I think it was by Rebecca Long Bailey during her campaign to start the thing called left-wing patriotism, basically. This idea that we shouldn't give the right completely this issue of loving your country and nationalism. And I think there is something in it, you know, like it doesn't have to be reactionary, but as you go through, there's all these heroes of the military that have done amazing things and revolutionary things and support progressive causes, but they're just buried because the left doesn't want to touch it because military bad, the right owns it, and we're missing a trick, really, aren't we? Can't we reformulate these hegemonic ideas and use the fact they're hegemonic, but use them for left-wing purposes? Is that possible?
I don't know if it's possible. I like the idea of it. I mean, the idea has it's quite a kind of seductive idea, isn't it? I don't know how easy it would be to do that. Obviously, the right owns that terrain. It really owns that terrain. And I think what could happen is we end up kind of just being on the losing side of the eternal culture war. I don't know if we want to fight them on their own terrain, if you know what I mean. I think those ideas have value. But I'm also at a stage, like we've all been through a big defeat and a battering. Loads of us threw our weight into Corbynism to different degrees. I mean, where does that project go? I don't believe, and I think this was a mistake with Corbynism, that the left, however you formulate that, can just grab the levers of power of the state. Like the left could not just take control of the state and the army. Centuries of ingrained privilege and power. You guys at Declassified yourself wrote a really good article on how immediately the kind of antibodies of state power and ruling class power started to brief against Corbyn. MI6 people, MI5 people, generals briefing against Corbyn. That would have stopped if the Labour took power. Well, I feel like any project like that basically is kind of teeing you up to, it's a kind of an attempt at state power. You're trying to recondition kinds of nationalism and patriotism. It seems to me to be about the state. And I think that route is closed. I think that route is closed now. There's no way there's going to be another £1 vote. And the Labour Party is on its, well, it'll probably limp on for a long time, but I think is not how can I put it, fertile ground for the left anymore. I think we have to look outside that. I think the reason people are clinging to that Sometimes it's vested interest. Sometimes it's the fact that there's patronage in that project still. But it's also a degree of trauma. Like you have to let go. It's melancholia when we need mourning. Let it go. It's died. Start to build outside parties and stop being obsessed with state power that you're never going to get. You're not going to get anywhere near it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that answers that. This is from Pete. I have a theory that squaddy mental health problems might arise from having to face the contradiction between the propaganda shite shoved at them and the common sense awareness of the ridiculousness of so much military action, Northern Ireland, Iraq, etc. Comment. Interesting point. We have touched on this, but we haven't actually talked about the psychological impacts that this contradiction has between the media portrayal, not only of the veteran experience, but also of the operations they're on and the reality on the ground of what's happening to them and the operations themselves. So what do you think this has a really bad impact on the mental health of serving soldiers and veterans?
I think it can, and I think that's the case for moral injury, where your values, your own or the ones the military instill into you, are shattered by the reality of warfare. That you can't no longer think of yourself as moral because something terrible has happened, or someone above you has done something bad, and you feel betrayed. Of course, that's a compounding factor. I think what I try to do in the book is go a different way. What I try to look at, and there's quite a lot of evidence for this, is the effects of training and culture. I think when we talk about wartime trauma, we kind of let the military off the hook because that could happen or it could not happen. You could or could not have a PTSD-inducing event. But what a lot of stuff comes from is the kind of programming, the indoctrination, the brutalizing impacts of training, whether we mean basic training or further training through your career. And also just military culture, the kind of hyper-macho, violent, urgent culture of the military. And so I have a chapter on the effects of training and culture and how that I think a lot of veterans' problems actually come from that. But war trauma can compound it. It's like the icing on the cake. And I draw on the work of various ex-military psychologists, psychotherapists, medical professionals with military backgrounds. I try and keep it in the veterans, social workers, all of whom are ex-military themselves, ex-British military in most cases. And try and look at those impacts as well, because I think it's overlooked. I really think it's overlooked. And a lot of people, when they come out, what they're struggling with is military, is the institutional experience that they've been made to think in a certain way and react to things in a certain way. And it's never been switched off. And so there are interesting conversations to be had about PTSD and moral injury, and they should be had. It's absolutely, I mean, I was diagnosed with PTSD myself. I'm not talking it down as a serious condition. But I think we really need to talk about training and culture as the origins of a lot of problems that ex-military people have. Yeah,
it's a kind of reprogramming, isn't it? That you've
exactly what it is. It's social engineering. I mean, they socially engineer you, and they need to change you. They need to make you fitter and stronger and make you kind of ingest certain values, but they need to change you inside. They need to change how you think and react. And that's why, for example, it's a cliche, but that's why veterans can have explosive tempers, because they've been trained to respond to stress explosively, to explode in the face to read stress and threat as violence, and the response to that should be violence. And that's what I talk about in the book.
Yeah, and I mean, we worked on a story together, didn't we, about how also the military institution itself, it doesn't really care about the grunts that they put out on the front line. They do to the degree that it makes them look bad in the press. But we did a story at the height of COVID about how actually they were using their involvement in the COVID response to try and recruit more soldiers. They had all these kind of emotional advertising campaigns about how your country needs you and stuff. You know, this kind of really ridiculous stuff, when in fact we looked at the figures, they didn't need any, the numbers of soldiers that they were putting out to react to COVID was small enough that there was no need for people.
Yeah. I mean, it's PR. They wanted to recruit, and there was a lot of recruiting going on, and they saw it. We found an MOD official tweeting in crisis opportunity about the COVID, about the opportunity for the military to use COVID, and they also wanted to recalibrate. I mean, it's a failed army. It's a defeated army. Yeah. We lost in Iraq and we lost in Afghanistan. They wanted to recalibrate themselves and bathe themselves in the kind of sepia World War II tones, which coloured COVID. They wanted to Captain Tomify themselves using COVID and frame themselves as a kind of humanitarian force. It's all there in that article. It's on Declassified, to which you should all subscribe immediately after this.
And it was quite funny. I mean, the kind of flagship project which they put out, and there was like all these amazing puff pieces in the corporate media about the XL Centre. I can't remember what it was called now. What did they?
The Nightingale's Hospital.
The Nightingale Hospital, exactly. So they had all this amazing stuff about all these soldiers in there building this hospital, and then about a couple of months later, there were all these stories about literally not one patient had used it, and it was actually being shut down without serving like having served a handful of patients. So it was all propaganda, and that's the problem as well. Is that the MOD, such a large part of it is just information operations.
Yeah,
and
I noticed one of the heads of the MOD communications. I've been rubbishing their comms the other day, and he followed me. Some guy, and half of his thread was about him being a young Tory, and half of it was just him retweeting Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier shit. So at least I'm appealing to the right crowd.
Yeah. A question from Will Moore. He says, Joe, do you think the separation from the institution without any deprogramming, this goes back to what we talked about, is a factor that is often overlooked? Leaving the fresh veteran trying to figure out who they are, potentially leading to the adoption of veteran as an identity.
Yeah, I think that's a problem. It's when I go over the statistics and I look at the definition of veteran, and statistically, the people most likely to identify really strongly as a veteran are working class white men. And I think it's also something about a society that's kind of hollowed out by neoliberalism. There's not much to cling to. And I think in a militarized society, the identity of a veteran is particularly powerful, and it's kind of a cheap and accessible ticket to all kinds of narratives, of far-right narratives, nationalist, patriotic narratives. And so, no, I definitely think that's the case. It's kind of what we talked about, that you go through basic training, at the end of it, there's a big pass-out parade, and you're all marching around in front of your mum and your girlfriend and your boyfriends, and now you're a soldier, and there's this moment of transition. Actually, it's much more subtle than that. But at the end, when you leave, you hand in your kit, and the veterans on this stream will attest, you hand in your kit and you're out the door, and that's it. And maybe down the line you have some problems and you're referred to a regimental association or the lumbering mechanisms of the RBL or Help for Heroes or combat stress. But there's no moment of deprogramming. I don't know what form that would take, but the obligation for that, given, if I'm right, and that's the argument I put, a lot of it's about training and culture, the obligation to do that is on the military, and not a suggestion that they might start doing that.
There's a question from Henry, which is, do you have any advice for talking to a parent about their veteranhood? Maybe he has a parent who's a veteran.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough one. I know lots of people. I like to think I've brought people over from the dark side, but it's a long process, because a lot of this stuff is deeply internalized, and in a sense, it has to be internalized because the training does have a function in that context. It's meant to keep you alive. It works in that context, that hard training and learning those new reactions, it's meant to keep you safe. But often when it does keep you safe, you start to think that the military is a perfect system and that the world is black and white. And this is the problem with Mercers and Ann Middletons and the kind of military hard men, is that they think they can understand the world in all its complexity through the lens of the hard as nails soldier bloke. And it just doesn't work. It's a bad lens to see things through. And it takes a lot of unpicking, and that's a slow process, which I think, talk to my friend Kristen Hughes, who's psychotherapist, that's a process which requires empathy. You can't just knock people out of it, you have to talk it through. You can't just go to them and say, oh, this is rubbish, you've been lied to. It's kind of a point, I think, that you have to arrive at yourself. But you do that by talking and using empathy. And that's very hard for the exact subject we're talking about, the hard as nails soldier bloke, because empathy and all these things are deeply emasculating. I've been through this process myself. I came out straight into the left, but there's still a process I had to go through and am going through. So it's a long process. Have faith. Do what you can, but be empathetic and understand it will be difficult.
I'm interested in just your perspective on PTSD, because you talked about how you've personally been diagnosed with it, and obviously it's a huge issue. I mean, I have a personal relationship with it through my grandfather, who was a prisoner of war from the fall of Singapore in the Second World War, and was sent to build the Burmese railway, which is famously the worst POW conditions in history, they say. And he came back completely changed and had undiagnosed PTSD, was doing all the sort of things that you talked about, like the fits of rage and violence and stuff like that. And I think that there's a degree of intergenerational trauma that happens. It's inherited trauma you get, and that's quite common. But at that time, when he came back from the Second World War, it wasn't really understood PTSD. They called it shell shock in the First World War, didn't they? But there's a lot of research that has happened that has been happening on PTSD. How prevalent is it, and how serious is it? How debilitating is it for the veteran community that suffers from it?
Yeah, I think it can be very debilitating. I don't know. I mean, the work you should refer to is Christian Hughes' work. He's on Twitter, and he's a psychotherapist, ex-military himself, who talks about this stuff a lot, really well. I had him on the Forces Watch podcast a couple of months ago, and he's really good at this stuff. Clearly, lots of people have it. It seems to be divided into kind of PTSD and complex PTSD, which I think for a long career soldier is when it's trauma or untreated trauma piled on top of each other over potentially decades. But I think, as much as I'm an ardent critic of the military, I think over the last 15 years, veterans' care in some ways has been forced to improve because of the optics, which is a tragedy that it's because of the optics. But also there are people who genuinely want to improve it. I do believe that, who want veterans to have dignified lives and be able to live their lives properly and not deal with these issues. So there is stuff you can do, and you can access a lot of it through the NHS now. I know Christian was involved in setting up some of the schemes around the country, and I genuinely think it's improved. Maybe there are problems with access, maybe there are problems with getting people to kind of go and get help. It's a problem with hard as nails military, Johnny McHard bloke to do that. But I think that stuff is there, and I think it probably has improved. To be fair to the kind of armed forces infrastructure, I think it probably has picked up a little bit.
Yeah, I have noticed that as well. I mean, King's College London they're basically a contractor for the MOD, and they produce a lot of research on PTSD, and there does seem to be a lot of money going into it. I have noticed that as well. This is from an anonymous attendee. Remembrance Sunday is coming up. Any thoughts on the white poppy vs red poppy debate? I find this debate at this stage is I understand why people ask it, but it just does my head in. Wear whatever poppy you want. VFP had the right position. If you want to wear a rainbow poppy, a blue poppy, a purple poppy, just wear it. Just wear it. I think too much is caught up in this symbol. The red poppy, to me, I don't wear it because I feel it's been hijacked. I understand a lot of older veterans, World War II veterans I've spoken to, do wear it because for them it's a symbol of kind of insurgent grief because their dads were in the trenches, which is the war from which the poppy originates. I personally, it does my head in every year. They always roll out that one footballer, James McLean, who doesn't wear a poppy because he's from Derry. And you can understand why someone from Derry might not want to wear a poppy. Makes complete sense. You've heard of Bloody Sunday. But they roll it out and they attack this one guy because he's from a Republican community in Derry. And it's just really, I find it really kind of staged and contrived and stupid. Like, wear whatever poppy you want. I will wear one, and I will, as soon as Remembrance is serious again, this is my Make America Great Again, is make Remembrance serious again. Lose the big death arms firms. I don't want to see BAE and Lockheed Martin down there. And I myself will put on all the poppies in the world, all the different colours, and my medals and my beret, and go to it. I think that the problem, it can't really be captured in the debate over the poppy. It's about remembrance being hijacked and getting remembrance back to the original sentiments of remembrance, which were grief and seriousness. Remembrance is a funeral. Cenotaph is a tomb. It's supposed to be a serious occasion, not Cheryl Cole in a fucking Diamante poppy on X Factor and like little girls dressed as poppies and a weird poppy wedding in the foyer of Sainsbury's somewhere. It's supposed to be a serious occasion, and that we should get back to that. It's the only sense in which I'm a conservative man. Like, make remembrance normal again. It's interesting as well, the role, the mythological role of the Second World War as well, because obviously, as you said, that was a good war in the sense that it was fought against Hitler. I agree with you. It had to be fought, and we won. And so much of the mythology around the military and around Britain's role in the world more generally is just based on that war. when in fact it was like a little blip we basically supported white supremacists and reactionary forces around the world forever, and we had this little 6-year blip, and that's what our national story is all about, and that's what the veteran story is about. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
And afterwards we went back to it. We went back to supporting the wars of the wars of decolonisation.
Yeah, and Operation Gladio was about empowering the Nazi remnants around, through Europe to destroy the left.
You know, the wars of decolonisation, for which quite a portion of declassified reportage, a lot of it's archival, and it comes from those the Mau Mau, Aden, Oman, Malaya, places like this. But yeah, it's a blip. It's an anomaly. The moral war is an anomaly, but it's used to colour every other war. And it's a point I talk about at length in the book. There's a sense in which they want us to believe that the people who stormed the beaches at Anzio and parachuted into Arnhem are somehow the same people, literally the same people, who were kicking doors in Iraq and Afghanistan and bombing things in Libya. This is not the case. This is not the army of World War II. There's no magic spiritual connective tissue between the two. It's a different time. It's a different army. They're different people. This is the martial fantasia, which is what so much of British identity is built on. And we have to. And
it's a mythology. It doesn't relate to facts, because, as you mentioned, all these operations to destroy decolonial movements, plus the fact that since 1964, we've had 10 soldiers embedded in the Saudi military to protect the House of Saud from a democracy movements or a coup or whatever it is. So the military is directly involved in propping up some of the worst repressive dictatorships in the world. So it's an insult to the memory of the Second World War.
It's the point I'm making in the book, like the case that we should go on about how our anti-fascist outing would be made stronger if we were not at this moment supporting authoritarian and fascist regimes militarily around the world. Like, make that case, but you can't trade off it forever, particularly not when we're training police forces and military forces and supplying bombs. And Saudi Arabia is the key example of fascist regime. So when you stop doing that, then you can talk about World War II seriously.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see. Okay. Hey, Joe. Not a veteran, but worked for the police, so dealt with violent death many times. The humour observation is spot on. Are we in a position where we simply have to sit out the passing of the Falklands generation, or is it a more problematic case of confronting our inherently hubristic history and the right-wing bias in our media? If the latter, beyond your book, how may we achieve that?
Yeah, it's going to be an ongoing process. I mean, the folk I talked about the bitterness of the Northern Ireland and Falklands generation. There's also lots of people from those generations who question that, who problematize that, who become political in a good way, who don't do that. So we have to be fair about that. Yeah, it's kind of an ongoing process to deal with that stuff. We're starting to build new media which challenges that. I work for the Canary, Matt works for Declassified, Novara do stuff on empire imperialism, these attitudes. There is a kind of constellation of sometimes colliding organizations which are starting to address these other narratives. So I think we have to keep building that. But it's tough because the hegemonic media is absolutely committed to imperialism and war. You know, the really powerful media is absolutely committed to those things, including Matt refers to the left flank of the ruling class, the Guardian, the Independent, the left flank of the establishment, I think refers. So yeah, it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but it's something we need to constantly challenge.
This is an interesting question from Luke. So again, an issue we've touched on, but I'd like an answer to this question as well. With the need to reimagine Britain or England, by the way things are going, with Scottish independence and whatever comes after that, how do we stop the right using the military and veterans in the culture war? Because you said previously just now that you don't think this is terrain that we should fight the right on because they're always going to win, which is a fair enough strategic outlook. But in that case, how do we fight the culture war on these issues? Do we just ignore it completely, or what do we do?
Well, it's difficult, and I'm probably that well placed to answer, but I don't think we can win the culture war as it is. And I think it's a waste of time when we try to. I'm guilty of it as well. I love a bit of a cultural punch up, and you know I do. And I think Luke, if it's Luke I'm thinking of, also knows, and he does as well. I think it's very hard to win on because it's deeply embedded. You'd need some like serious process, almost of like denazification, to deal with the kind of products of British imperial myth, which inform so many of these things. I mean, I think you have to fight a war on something else, on economic arguments and stuff like that. But also, I think you do, and this is a point Paul Mason made, actually, that you do need some other kind
of... That sentence isn't allowed in this webinar.
He's on the front. He's on the front.
I'm just joking. Go on, carry on.
I mean, there has to be some alternative kind of culture we can propose, which is more positive than the ones the kind of mythologized weird ones that we're fighting over. I don't know what that looks like. There are theorists, which is definitely not me, who could probably speak to that in a much more profound way. And many of them write for repeater books.
I have I have an idea of what I think would work, which is that, you know, this Italian theorist Gramsci who talked about hegemony and the hegemonic ideas and how you basically achieve power through achieving hegemony with your ideas. And I think that one thing the left should do is look at society and look at what the hegemonic ideas are, and not just dismiss them, but try and work out how we can make them real. I.e., for example, the military and stuff, as we've talked about, it's a mythology, but the mythology is good. The mythology is that we spread human rights and democracy around the world, and there's these evil fascists or whatever it is, evil people that do bad things, and we are the good people that sort it out. Now, I'd love the UK military to be the armed wing of Amnesty International or whatever it would be. That'd be great. But it's not the fact. But what we can do is use the fact that most people believe that and like believing that. It makes them feel good. We have to campaign on the fact that, look, the truth is we don't mind, like we want our military to do good things, but the fact is it doesn't. It's propping up the Saudi regime. It's propping up the Gulf regimes. It's very anti-democratic. It's supporting repression all over the world. I think we can, but if we can sort of color it and frame it within ideas that are already hegemonic in society, I think we have some way to do it. And I think the same with patriotism, because I know Joe said that he doesn't think we can fight on that terrain. But a lot of working class people have pride in where they come from and pride in their country. And the pride is, again, based on these mythological ideas, but the ideas themselves aren't bad. So if we can tap into that, again, it's hard because it's like the toothpick against a fucking massive truck.
Yeah. I think, to come back on that point, I think the Labour Party can't do that.
Oh, right, yeah, sorry.
I think, maybe there is some scope.
No, I agree with that. I think the Labour Party can't do anything because it's there to stop the left getting power. So exactly. as was showed with Corbyn. So yeah, but I guess in the absence of we talk about it at Declassified just on a sort of how in terms of outreach, how do we reach more people? And I think for that, obviously this isn't about taking control of the state or anything big like that, but in terms of just even getting your ideas out there. I always say, like, let's try and work out what are the big kind of hegemonic ideas that people believe and try and use those even in headlines or whatever to try and so people are attracted to us. And I think that the left doesn't do much of that because they're sort of, they're institution or they're instinctively against any of these sort of right-wing ideas engaging.
The left doesn't know what it's for or against. I, however, am for Phil Miller for Prime Minister.
Yeah, Phil Miller is the chief reporter at Declassified. In my opinion, the best investigative journalist in the UK. Yeah, he's a terrier, but and he's a good example. And we should. I know we haven't got much time left, but we should talk just finally about the media and how it covers this stuff, because Phil's a good example of someone who is clearly incredibly talented, gets more stories than the rest of the media combined in terms of revealing important information about the UK military and the UK's role in the world. He's writing for Declassified. Now, I think Declassified is a good organisation, but 20 years ago, he would have been on the front page of the Times every day, you know, and he's not. And I don't even think there's much risk of him getting poached because he's too good. They don't want people like that doing it. So can you just talk a little bit about your experiences of the media and the problem we have with the media and how we get around that on these issues?
With veteran stuff, with military stuff.
Yeah, and military and
I talk about it. I talk about it in the book. I mean, we know the stories and we laugh about them often because they're every week. But I can remember recently there was a story. There was 3 or 4 papers of note. It was like Times, the Mail, all reported the same story. It was about General Carlton Smith getting lost in a field because the helicopter put him down somewhere. And it was this weird, whimsical story that all of the defence reports, I think the BBC, Jonathan, whatever his name is, did it as well. Don't hold me to that, Jonathan. This ridiculous story about, oh, look at Tarquin. He got lost in a field somewhere. Isn't it funny? The papers of note all covered it. They like fell in step on this ridiculous story. And the other ones come up. Like there was one about the heads of the commanding officers of the SAS and the SBS having a bake-off style competition in like Wales Online and how the SBS won. This is the level of defence journalism. Weirdly, the Times in the last few weeks, I don't know if they've stopped being invited, but the Times have actually started doing some really hard-hitting journalism on sexual violence, sexual abuse, and a recruit, training corporal beating up recruits yesterday. So I don't know what's happened at the Times. Maybe
outbreak of journalism. Yeah, it's weird.
It's weird because the right-wing media's defence coverage is like the best defence coverage outside declassified because they have access, because they have these ties. And it's I suspect because a lot of the time they will do what they're told. They will keep their nose clean. They won't rock the boat too much because they want to go to the cocktail parties and go on plane trips with Ben Wallace and Leo Doherty and the rest of the defence ministers. But it's a terrible, terrible state of affairs. I mean, the beacon in all of this is obviously declassified, who've been blacklisted about 47 times, however many it is. And then I've had like international press organisations demanding they be unblacklisted, which probably tells a story. But I think there's something about the defence media, which is client journalism. I mean, they want to be at the things. And occasionally they might push around the edges, but I think they're mostly, apart from the Times for the last 2 weeks, I don't know what's happened there, they mostly won't do really hard-hitting stories, which is their job. And there's a democratic problem with the militarism that we see today, is that it stops critique and inquiry. There's nothing special about the MOD. There's nothing special about the army. You would do a critical article about the DWP or any other government department. That is what it is. It's not made of magic. It's not special. It won't break or crash. If you write something critical about it, report it more rigorously than those other departments, because it's a department of the state concerned with violence, with state violence, and so it should be held even more accountable, I would argue. But that's not how it plays out.
I'm wary of time. I've got a few more questions, just a couple more. Just quickly before I forget, I wanted to ask you a question. All right, George has just come up with a good question. He says, have you been asked to talk about your book on the Owen Jones YouTube show yet? I would add, would you do it if you were?
Oh, I don't. Me and Jones diverged some years ago. I don't have any personal beef with the guy. Political differences, I think.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Do you know what? I don't want to be the siloed left. I'll talk to anyone.
Yeah, that's good.
I'll talk to anyone. As long as you're not a fascist, I'll come and talk to you.
And just
like if you're a veteran who runs a weird, cranky, new age, fascist, right-wing podcast, maybe not. But I'll talk to anyone about these ideas because I think they're important.
And what's your next move? I mean, obviously you're going to spend some time promoting the book and trying to get that out. But are you planning? Have you got ideas for other books? Are you going to continue working for the Canary? Do you want to write fiction? What's the next move for Glenton?
I've got other books I would like to do. It's not completely fixed what they are yet. I would love to turn my hand at fiction, but it's a terrifying prospect. I don't know if I've got it in me. It seems like a totally different thing. More documentaries coming up in far off and interesting parts of the world, which have been brutally afflicted by British imperialism. But I can't give you too many details at the moment. Definitely more books. To be honest, I feel like the book is a journey. It's about this journey, about a kind of tour guide. And I don't want to sound like some new age weirdo, but it kind of has been a journey as of the last 10 years. And I feel like I've come to a point. The book was a kind of exorcism. I'm 40 next year. I don't want to take this into my 40s. And I feel like I can now put some of that stuff. I'll always be interested in and connected to military stuff, clearly. But I feel like there's been a kind of exorcism which took place in those highly affordable, beautifully written pages, which you can get at www.repeater or whatever. But I feel like I've reached a better point after 10 years of being churned up by this thing.
Okay, I'm going to ask one final question. And this is from, I don't know how you pronounce this, N-I-W-E. I don't know if that's the name, but it says, hi, do you envision a society in which there's no army? So this, some people would read that your book and that would be the logical conclusion, that you just think the army is a bad thing. Is that true? Or do you think that the army has to be repurposed? Or is it always going to be the institution that it was to you and is now?
No, I don't. I mean, it's kind of like the police, the Met Police. It's unreformable. It's unreformable. That is not to say I'm not a pacifist. As soon as whatever mythical enemy, the stormtroopers of Darth Vader or the Taliban or whatever, as soon as they turn up down at Dover Docks, I'll be the first one down there with a machine gun to fight them off. And so will Kennard, I imagine. But I don't. I don't
think they'd want me, but yeah, I'll be down there.
I'll show you how to use it. I'm not a pacifist in that sense. I suspect there will be person-to-person violence will continue. I have no say in that. But what form that takes, I don't know. There are other examples of how armies, how military functions can be performed in society. And one of the best ones is here in this country. I mean, you have the example of the New Model Army. You have anti-fascist militias through various points of history which were democratic. So it's really about reformulating what that would look like. And but basically, I'm trying to be practical. I don't have power to dissolve the army, but I certainly don't think it can be reformed. I think that's a mistake for any budding parliamentary electoral type people. If that's your politics, that's your bag. I think it's a mistake to think that you can just seize the Met Police or the British Army or the Royal Navy and kind of wield it as your own weapon. I don't think that's how it works, and I think it needs to be seriously. You need to seriously think about those ideas.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we said we would finish by 8:30, so I think we're over that time. So I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Joe for that really interesting discussion. And I could listen to Joe for a lot longer, but I don't want to keep you all. And I've got 2 kids that I've got to put to bed. So, but I would say finally that everyone who's on this call should buy the book and spread the word, because Joe has taken a path which means he's, and it's a path I guess I've taken as well, which is that we've rejected the mainstream. And that means that you lock off a lot of opportunities for outreach and getting your work out. I think it's a price worth paying, because you can say the truth and you can be true to yourself. But it does mean that it relies on people spreading the word by word of mouth and in their local communities. And I think with this book, we need to do that, because I think it has the potential to really be a classic. It's written in a completely unique way about an issue which is not covered at all, and definitely not covered in this way, and hasn't really ever been before. So if we can spread the word and get people buying it, I think it could really change things and maybe start the process towards change that we've been talking about in this call. So yeah, spread the word, buy the book, big up Joe around the place. Yeah, I think that, I don't know if I hand back to Houseman's now. I mean, do you have anything final you want to say, Joe, before we hang up?
No, thanks for doing that. I've always felt, because of what you said, we both kind of stepped off the beaten path in our careers. But you've ended up at Declassified, so I would encourage everyone here to sign up and support Declassified. It is where all the best journalism on defence, intelligence, military stuff, archival stuff around the histories of empire, all the best stuff is emerging there. It really is a beacon among a lot of absolutely mediocre journalism. So support it. It's really, really important that you do that.
Thank you, yeah. Great. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Enjoy the book if you haven't read it already, and take care, everyone.
Thank you.